From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. The refugee crisis in Ukraine is spinning out of control as civilians flee combat zones in fear for their lives. Neighboring countries are doing their share, but the sheer size of the crisis calls for an urgent international response. The U.S. pledged to take in 100,000 refugees. What to make of such a charitable gesture? To discuss all this, in New York, I'm joined by Dr. Simon Adams. He's the president and CEO of the Center for Victims of Torture. Dr. Adams, thank you for joining us at this hour. You raised the alarm in an article published last Friday saying that the global refugee crisis is getting out of hand. Now, with the Russia-Ukraine conflict dragging on, Europe is now at the epicenter of this all. What is most striking about the current crisis?
No, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think that is true. I think the refugee crisis that's been called by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine is now radiating across Europe. You know, we've seen Poland welcome in something like over 3 million refugees, Romania, Moldavia, Slovakia. I think in a couple of hours, something like 25,000 people, even in the UK, offered up their homes to Ukrainian refugees. And that's fantastic. I think that should be applauded, the empathy that people are showing to refugees. But we are at a time when we have historic levels of displacement caused by persecution, by conflict and atrocities. Over 82 million people around the world, from Syria, to Cameroon, Venezuela, and of course to Ukraine. So I'd love to see that empathy expanded to other frontiers, to other people. We need to kind of end this globalization of indifference that's taken place over the last couple of years, and we need to respond to all these refugee crises with a similar level of compassion and empathy.
So Dr. Adams, you mentioned the globalization of indifference. Can you elaborate? Do you think there's a double standard somehow, when it comes to treatment of European refugees versus refugees in Africa and the Middle East, for example?
Yeah, and I should say, by the way, that was the Pope's term. I borrowed that term from him. I want to make sure that I give credit, but he was speaking to, I think, something that's a real problem in the world at the moment, is we do sometimes see that there's a kind of a hierarchy of suffering. I think it's very sad that we've had so many reports, even when we see this tremendous and positive response in some European countries, African exchange students who are studying in Ukraine being pushed back from the border, other people being treated with racist hostility. And I think over the last couple of years, we've seen in so many places in the world, this kind of toxic politics of rising xenophobia directed particularly against refugees turning up in other people's countries, whether they be Syrians, Afghans, or wherever they are. And I think that's a very, very sad thing. So I think that rather than kind of point out the negative here of the double standard, what I would prefer to do is to say that the very basic human compassion being shown by people towards Ukrainians is something we should celebrate, but we should say Ukrainians are not the only people facing war, not the only people facing persecution, atrocities, and suffering at the moment. And we need to export that compassion to other groups of people as well.
Right. Sir, refugees have to go through a terrible ordeal. We all know that. Fleeing their homes is just the tip of the iceberg. They need protection from petty humiliation and overt exploitation, to name just a few. How do you think we can ensure that their basic human rights are protected?
I think this is a very important question. I think in too many parts of the world, we see that the world's most vulnerable populations, people who are fleeing war, who are fleeing conflict, end up becoming prey for human traffickers or for sex traffickers even. And I think that's a very sad thing. But I think there are many organizations in the world, credible NGOs who do work with refugees, my own organization included. There are also UN agencies. And so again, I think what we need at this time of unprecedented kind of historic levels of displacement, highest levels since the Second World War, it has to be said. What we need is more states to get behind that international humanitarian system and make sure that we're able to cope with this flow of human beings who are fleeing.
President Joe Biden of the United States said last Thursday that the U.S. would accept up to 100,000 refugees from Ukraine. The U.S. will provide $1 billion in new funding. Some say this is too little, too late. What do you think?
I think it's a very important gesture, and I think it sends a signal, the right kind of signal, that this is not just Poland's problem or not just a Ukrainian issue. It shows that there needs to be a global response to the Ukrainian situation. I also, and I wrote about this in the article that you mentioned before very kindly, I wrote about this also, though, exposing some of the weaknesses in the US system. I think this should be an opportunity for President Biden to kind of repair and rebuild the US system around refugee resettlement and around asylum seekers.
Some commentators, including those writing op-ed for New York Times, said that President Joe Biden was bowing to domestic and international pressure to accept Ukraine's refugees. Is there some truth to this statement?
I do think there's some truth to that statement, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I'd rather have public sentiment saying we need to be more compassionate, we need to do something to help people whose lives have been essentially upended and destroyed by war, rather than the reverse. And I think, when you look around the world at the moment, I've spoken several times about this massive displacement crisis. So many of the countries who are bearing the burden, who are bearing the weight of that crisis, are countries like Jordan or like Turkey, countries that maybe aren't as wealthy, as strong, or as powerful as some major European nations or as the United States of America. So I think we need better burden sharing to make sure that we can deal with this crisis.
Right. The U.S. has long been a safe haven for refugees, most notably welcoming tens of thousands of Jews, if not more, fleeing Russia and Eastern Europe at the turn of the 20th century, and also, their programs to welcome refugees from Asia during the height of the Cold War, namely from Vietnam, among other countries. What's different this time around?
Yeah, I think that there's an obvious thing, and I think it's very easy sometimes, particularly for Europeans or people of European descent, to look at what's going on in Ukraine, and they see people who might look like them. And so they identify, and maybe it's easier for them to empathize. But my experience, working with refugees and asylum seekers and visiting places, for example, in the United States and around the world that deal with refugee populations, that there is a general human sympathy for other human beings, regardless of the color of their skin or their religion. So I think we really need to see more of that.
Sure. The U.S. alone or with its allies have invaded or bombed countless countries in the past 30 years. It is no secret. The U.S. is also supporting and financing military operations in many hot spots of the world. Tens of millions of people have been affected in Iraq, Serbia. Let's not forget Serbia, right? Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, the list goes on. Are we witnessing a change in attitude somehow, given the fact that these round of refugee crises are those originating from Europe?
I don't think it's a new era in that sense. I don't think there's any permanent member of the UN Security Council that has completely clean hands when it comes to any of these issues. But I think, this invasion of Ukraine has obviously been a real challenge to the international system. And so I think that has caused people to think about are we living in a new era? Are we living in a new Cold War? I don't necessarily agree with that language, but I think it's certainly time for all nations of the world, including very powerful nations like China and the United States and others, to stand firmly and squarely behind international law and behind the idea that big nations, regardless of who they are, whether it be Russia, the United States, or anybody else, can't simply invade their neighbors because they don't like the politics of that government there.
Also, finally, the global refugee crisis is not going to disappear overnight. You wrote that there are currently 84 million people displaced by conflict, persecution, and atrocities. The Office of the UNHCR experts expects this figure to reach 100 million. Is the world prepared for a crisis of such magnitude?
I don't think it is. And I think that's what we're seeing now with the kind of desperate measures because again, the Ukrainian situation is just the tip of the iceberg. It's going to take a massive effort by, I think, all the leading states of the United Nations and others to actually get behind trying to solve this international humanitarian catastrophe.
You're the president and CEO of the Center for Victims of Torture. You have been working on helping those refugees over the past years and decades. What are the practical challenges during your line of work?
Well, I think there's many challenges, not least of all denialism of some governments that torture is a problem either in their own countries or in other people's countries. And certainly what we find at the moment with our work, and my own organization, as you said, works in a number of countries, works with refugees, works with asylum seekers. I think the biggest problem we face at the moment is capacity. There is simply, unfortunately, far more demand for our services than there is a capacity for us to provide it, even though we're treating about 20,000 survivors of torture every year. And I think that's a very sad indictment of the world that we live in, that we simply cannot meet the demand from survivors for the kinds of counseling and support that my organization provides.
Yeah, hopefully all those in need will be helped eventually. Dr. Simon Adams, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.